of the most anticipated moments of this year's US presidential election campaign is just a day away. Tuesday night's TV debate will be the first ever face-to-face meeting between Vice President Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. At the moment, it's the only scheduled debate that both campaigns have agreed to. With the latest polls showing the two candidates neck and neck, there's a lot at stake in tomorrow's showdown, since many pundits are predicting that November's result will be decided by just a small number of voters in half a dozen key battleground states. Swaying those viewers could prove decisive. Over the weekend, the Harris campaign picked up endorsements from former Republican Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz. Now, Liz Cheney used to be a leading Republican in Congress until she was sidelined for criticising Donald Trump over his attempt to overturn the 2020 election result.
I've never voted for a Democrat. And it tells you, I think, the stakes in this election. Donald Trump presents a challenge and a threat fundamentally to the republic. At the end of the day, the vast majority of people in this country want to know fundamentally that their elected officials are going to defend the peaceful transfer of power and that they are going to put the Constitution first.
I'm honored to have their support, and I think it's an important statement right now. A lot of what I think is happening, and I was just talking with some folks here in Pittsburgh about it, is that people are exhausted about the division and the attempts to kind of divide us as Americans.
We're run by stupid people. Stupid people. And we found that out at the debate with Joe. How did that work out? And we're going to find it out again on Tuesday night. She will be the worst president. He is the worst president in history. She will be worse than him. She will be worse than him. And Trump is never wrong. I am never, ever wrong.
May as well not have the election then, eh? Now, we're pleased to be joined tonight by Allan Lichtman, who's Distinguished Professor of History at American University. He knows pretty much all there is to know about US elections. Professor Lichtman is the author of the book Predicting the Next President and has correctly predicted 9 out of the 10 elections going back to 1984. Welcome to DW, Professor. We'll ask for your prediction for this year shortly. First, though, let's look at Tuesday night's debate. The candidates are polling neck and neck. Do you expect this debate to shift the needle at all?
Look, I don't care what the polls say. The polls are snapshots. They are abused by people like Nate Silver and the Princeton Polling Consortium as though they were predictors. That's why those compilers of polls were so badly wrong in 2016 when I called Donald Trump and they were predicting an overwhelming likelihood that Hillary Clinton will win. The polls showed as late as October that Mitt Romney was going to beat Barack Obama. I stuck with my prediction against the polls that Barack Obama was going to win. As late as June, July of 1988, the polls had George H.W. Bush 17 points behind his opponent, Mike Dukakis. The pollsters and the pundits were saying no one can overcome this deficit. At that same time,
let me just jump in there. So at the moment, as I say, the polls have them neck and neck. You're convinced that the polls don't know what they're talking about? The polls aren't predictive. They're not accurate. Okay.
They're not predictive. And the error margin is, they tell you the error margin's plus and minus about 3%. But that's pure statistical error. What they don't tell you is there is very large non-statistical error on top of that.
Okay.
People don't respond. They lie. They haven't focused. No one's voted yet, so they have to guess the likely voters. So the polls are so widely in error that you can't use them.
Given the wealth of your experience, what do you see as the strength of each of these candidates going into this debate?
Again, unask the question. It's another Zen question. My system, the keys to the White House, does not depend upon the candidates.
We're going to get to that. I'm asking for your thoughts on the candidates.
No, I don't have any thoughts about that because it leads us again down the primrose path of error. You cannot predict election results by looking at the characteristics of the candidate. Was Hillary Clinton a worse candidate than Donald Trump? Was Hubert Humphrey a worse candidate than Richard Nixon, one of the most reviled figures, even to that point in U.S. history? Was John Kerry worse than George W. Bush? I won't go down that direction because it's another way we create errors.
Understood. All right, let's talk about your predictions, which I read you based on what you call your 13 keys to the White House.
Right.
These are the conditions that favour the re-election of the incumbent party. If 5 or fewer don't hold true, as you see, then you predict the incumbent party will win. And if 6 or more are false, then the incumbents face defeat. So we're not going to go through all 13 tonight, but we'll look at a couple. Let's start with keys 5 and 6, the short-term and long-term economy. At a rally in August, Donald Trump criticised what he called Kamala Harris's radical liberal policies, saying that they've caused horrific inflation and blaming Bidenomics for the rapid rise in prices since 2020. What do your keys say about the former president's economic assessment?
Sure. Take the rhetoric of candidates and do with it what the great philosopher David Hume said you should do to works of superstition. Consign them to the flames. My short-term and long-term economic keys are statistical. They have nothing to do with what candidates say. The short-term economic key says the economy is not in recession during the election year. An answer of true always favors the White House party. There is no recession. No way in the next 2 months a recession is going to grip the U.S. That key favors the Democrats. My long-term economic key is also statistical. Did growth, real per capita during the Biden term, the current term, at least equal the average of the previous 2 terms? And growth under Biden has been more than double the average of the previous 2 terms. So that key is also true, favoring the incumbents.
OK, let's look at key number 8, which was sustained social unrest. You say there hasn't been any. What would you call the months of campus demonstrations the US saw, protesting for and against American policy towards Israel and indeed Israel's policy towards Gaza?
There are always demonstrations and protests every year. But again, you've got to stick to the definition of the keys. I've been attacked saying my keys are subjective. They're not. They're very carefully defined, and they've been answered at least retrospectively since 1860 and prospectively since 1984. To turn that key, it has to be massive, sustained social unrest, sufficient to call into question the stability of the society, like we saw in the 1960s when millions of people were out in the streets. The cities were up in flames. Nothing approaching that, despite the sporadic demonstrations, which, by the way, fizzled away at the Democratic convention. So that key is clearly true, not close.
OK. So what is your prediction then for the outcome of November's election?
I am predicting a path-breaking new president, that Kamala Harris will become the first woman president of the United States. Maybe not shattering the glass ceiling, but at least cracking it. And she also becomes the first president of combined African and East Asian descent. Remember, the keys are measured against the strength and unit and performance of the White House party. It takes 6 keys to count them out. Under the worst case scenario, they only lose 5 keys. And under the more plausible scenario, they only lose 4. So my prediction is firm.
OK. So, and how long did it take you to come to that conclusion? So these keys, as you say, all based in statistics, how long do you compile them before you come to a conclusion?
Well, they're not all quite statistical, but they're all carefully defined. I start tracking my keys the moment a new administration takes place. And sometimes, not this time, the keys fall into place early. For example, my first prediction was the re-election of Ronald Reagan in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time, during the worst recession to date since the Great Depression, when his approval ratings were down in the dumps. I called the very tough to call 2012 election in 2010. In fact, gratuitously, out of the blue, I was attacked by Nate Silver saying, you can't make a prediction this early. And being a professor, of course, I responded with a long paper, which boiled down to the fact that you can't, because you're just a compiler of polls, which are useless at this point. But I can, because my system tracks how elections really work. So I'm on the job all the time.
Okay. So November will tell the truth. Professor Allan Lichtman from American University calling November's election for Kamala Harris. Thank you so much for joining us and talking us through that.
Thank you. My pleasure.